Welcome to The Garden Astronomer. I'm Wayne McGraw, and today we're diving into the story of the Comet of 1811, a companion to a shaking world. It's December 15th, 1811, on the Mississippi River. They entered the big river on a cold morning, 3 barges and 2 keelboats drifting out of the Ohio and into the broad sweep of the Mississippi. By evening, they had anchored on a sandbar 10 miles above Little Prairie, a small river town near what is now Caruthersville, Missouri. Evening darkened, pipes glowed on deck. Someone passed the last of the hardtack and coffee. An older hand pointed low in the west, where a glow hung above the tree line. "There she is again," he said. A younger boatsman peered upward. "You can still see the tail." The captain leaned on the rail, eyes narrowed. "Been fading these past weeks. Folks back east call it Napoleon's Comet." He paused, voice low. "Me, I just call it trouble that won't quit." One by one, they turned in after the comet sank under the horizon. Hours later, near 2 a.m, the hull shook as if something seized them from below. "What is that?" The captain darted for the rail. "Snag, we struck bottom. Hold fast." "No, feel that?" another voice cried. "The whole river's moving. It's alive under us." The boats lurched and rolled. "Earthquake!" someone screamed. "God help us, it's an earthquake." They waited out the darkness that night, wondering if another tremor would hit. At first light, they pulled anchor and shoved off. Minutes later, the earth bucked again, twice harder than before. Chunks of riverbank slid away, trees toppling and submerging into the muddy water, and one would recall the whole atmosphere was impregnated with a sulfurous smell. Farther downstream, the steamboat New Orleans was making her maiden voyage down the same river. Years later, local historian H.C. Bradsby captured the memory in writing. It was the severe stay of the great throes of the New Madrid earthquake. At the same time, a fiery comet was rushing athwart the horizon. The quakes back then would be remembered as among the largest in recorded North American history. All the while, the Great Comet hung above and watched the upheaval below. But the story's roots lie far from that river. To follow the comet's path, we have to look back, 8 months earlier, to the southern skies above France. It's March 25th, 1811, in Viviers, France. Honoré Flaugergues was no famous astronomer, just an amateur working from a modest setup in a small town. That early spring evening, he swept his telescope across the southern skies through the now lost constellation of Argo Navis. A smudge caught his eye. It could easily be a wisp of cloud. He noted the position in his notebook and waited. He looked again later, and the light had moved. He had discovered a comet. By modern charts, it lay within the borders of the constellation Puppis. However, not all the watching was done from European observatories. At the Madras Observatory in India, Captain John Warren, a military surveyor turned astronomer, had been keeping watch. His assistant first saw the comet as a faint patch of nebulosity on April 25th. Warren observed, "I have the honor to inform you that on the evening of the 25th, the head assistant at the observatory reported to me that he had seen a faint luminous appearance, which he suspected might be a comet. On the 26th in the evening, I observed the same phenomena, whose appearance was somewhat brighter than the nebula in Andromeda." By late May, the comet brightened enough for naked eye viewing, and then the tailed visitor slipped into the sun's glare and vanished. Astronomers had to wait its return. August brought the comet's return. It crept north of the sun, low after sunset, woven into the thick blue of twilight. Most who searched for it found only darkness. Around the middle of the month, the first recorded sightings came in as the comet brightened. On August 22nd, Johann Bode in Berlin spotted it in the northwest through his telescope. It was bright enough near second or third magnitude for a brief peak before it set. Night by night, the comet climbed. By August's end, its head glowed like a lantern behind a thin, draped window. The hot, dry summer of 1811 dragged on until it gave way to a golden autumn. In the vineyards of Cognac and Champagne, Bordeaux and Burgundy, grapes fattened under the sun's glare. The harvest was heavy, the fruit sweet and full. Bottles on cork that year drew reverence. Some called it the finest in memory, others the finest of the century. In Cognac, Napoleon received a barrel for his infant son, and bottles were labeled with the date and comet. In Champagne, Barbe Nicole Clicquot refined her riddling method, producing the celebrated Cuvée de la Comet. At Chateau d'Yquem, bottles from the 1811 vintage were set aside and forgotten. They survived wars, revolutions in winemaking, and the long drift of centuries. When Robert Parker finally tasted one in 1996, he awarded it a perfect score. In 2011, another bottle from that same vintage sold at auction for £75,000. That's around $120,000. Then a record for a white wine. To many winemakers of the time, the comet seemed inseparable from the harvest itself. Some spoke of the vintage as if the sky had touched the grapes. The association endured, in fact. Ever since, comet vintages and labels have remained in the language of wine thanks to the Great Comet of 1811. Now our story turns to the skies of autumn. While vintners spoke of omens, astronomers and ordinary observers alike found themselves drawn skyward. By October, the comet was simply not to miss. It stayed in the northern sky through the whole night, circling the pole without setting. The famous British astronomer William Herschel measured the tail at 25 degrees on October 6th. That's an arc of pale light stretching across a quarter of the sky. Just imagine that. By the time of its closest approach to Earth on October 16th, the head had swollen into a hazy disk as bright as Jupiter. Decades later, the naval officer and astronomer William Henry Smythe still remembered the sight clearly enough to compare it to Donati's comet of 1858. The 1811 comet's branched tail was of great interest, he wrote. The nucleus with its head veil was more distinct. 19-year-old John Linnell, living in England, was searching for something far more profound. From a second-floor window at the Royal Academy in London, the young artist spent the autumn nights sketching the comet. Linnell was not merely practicing his craft. He was in the midst of a spiritual awakening, drawn deeply into the Baptist faith and the philosophy of natural theology. This doctrine held that the divine was not found in abstract dogma, but in the observable truth of the physical world. To paint nature with absolute precision was to trace the very brushstrokes of God. Now, not every observer in England had such clear views, worldly or otherwise. In Norwich, England, 9-year-old Harriet Martineau was having a difficult time. While her family crowded around the windows at the top of her father's warehouse, Harriet stood in a state of desperation. In her autobiography, written decades later, she recalled the memory with a combination of humor and a little bit of wounded pride. She writes, "The exclamations on all hands about the comet perfectly exasperated me because I could not see it." Now, despite having, as she says, remarkably good eyes, the young future sociologist ended up at odds with the philosophers who could see the celestial visitor with ease. Half a world away, an anonymous Russian nun watched the same comet from her convent. She later wrote of how its brilliant light seemed to foretell disaster, and then Napoleon's army entered Moscow. She writes, "Every night the comet blazed in the heavens, and we all asked ourselves, what misfortune does it bring? Then the enemy came, and our sacred city was put to the torch." By autumn, the comet had gathered meaning and even more symbolism. In Europe, some called it Napoleon's comet. You see, a brilliant comet had blazed in the skies just days before Bonaparte's birth in August 1769. Napoleon, ever attuned to symbols and omens, now saw another comet grace the night skies as his armies marched. To some, it was favor, to others, warning. Across the ocean, the comet wore a different name and a different symbolism. Tecumseh, the Shawnee war chief whose name meant shooting star, spent much of 1811 traveling among native nations. He urged tribes to set aside old rivalries and join together in a confederacy to resist American expansion into their lands. When the brilliant comet appeared that autumn, he pointed to it as a dramatic omen and a shooting star sent by the Great Spirit as confirmation that the moment for unity had arrived. So at this time in history, we have two names for one object: Napoleon's in Europe, Tecumseh in America. Two leaders trying to hold together crumbling orders. Both would soon fail. Napoleon's empire buckled, Tecumseh died in battle in 1813, and his confederacy unraveled. The comet belonged to neither, but it did illuminate them both. In the years that followed, the comet settled into storytelling. When Leo Tolstoy placed the comet in War and Peace, he was trying to chart the heavens through a human perspective. In the novel, the character Pierre steps into the night at a turning point in his life. He's restless, searching, and beginning to sense that the path behind him has led nowhere. Overhead, the comet burns, which many around him take as a sign of coming disaster. But Pierre looks up and feels something else entirely. Not fear, but reassurance. Tolstoy writes, "But this bright comet with its long, shiny tail held no fears for Pierre. Quite the reverse. Pierre's eyes glittered with tears of rapture as he gazed up at this radiant star. It seemed perfectly attuned to Pierre's newly melted heart as it gathered reassurance and blossomed into new life." You know, there is poetic irony in that. As the comet burned its way into Russia's literary soul, it was vanishing from the Russian sky. On August 12th, astronomer Vincent Wyszynski peered through his telescope and made the final recorded observation of the Great Comet. By that point, it had dwindled to a faint smudge, barely registering at an apparent magnitude of 11. You know, for those listening who are not astronomers, that means you would need a fairly large telescope and dark skies today to even just see a glimpse of it. For 260 nights, the comet remained visible to the naked eye. This record stood until the arrival of Hale-Bopp nearly 200 years later. Now, 2 centuries on, we sort through the harvest from the shaken ground, the wars from the sky, and lay them out like star charts on the grass. The comet itself did nothing. It passed above, while the rivers flooded, the earth trembled, and the generations moved through their seasons below it. It made no promises and issued no warnings. It simply appeared and moved on. What people found in it, they brought with them. Fear, wonder, confirmation of what they already believed. That is perhaps the most human thing of all, to look up at something indifferent and find it speaking directly to us. When a comet appears, we remember our place among the firmament. We are here only to witness it for a little while. The rest, as always, we bring ourselves. Thanks for listening in. Till then, clear skies.